Chapter 1. The Questing Knight's Oath. The Cursed Road to Mousillon. Julien de Calmont rode alone, the vast and twisted expanse of Mousillon's forests closing in around him like a noose. The air was thick with the stench of rotting leaves and something far fouler, something unseen that slithered beneath the moss-laden earth. Buford, his noble destrier, snorted uneasily, his hooves crunching over the tangled underbrush. Julien could feel the warhorse's tension rippling through the reins, the beast's instincts warning him of an unseen danger lurking beyond the skeletal trees. The Bretonnian knight gripped the hilt of his sword, the blade of Calmont, his fingers tightening around the familiar leather grip. Though he had faced many battles, routed beastmen, and held his own against the horrors of war, the forests of Mousillon stirred a different kind of fear, one that no steel could cut away. The sky was choked with thick, rolling clouds, and the feeble light of the setting sun bled crimson through the gnarled branches. Somewhere in the distance, a raven croaked a hoarse, mocking call. "Why do you test me, my lady?" Julien murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. His heart was steadfast, but doubt clawed at the edges of his resolve. He had left behind the comforts of his home, forsaken his title, abandoned the life of a lord's son to seek the Grail, and yet there was nothing, no blessing, no sign, only endless roads and the silence of a God who did not answer. Tonight that silence would break. The vision of the silver chalice. Julien made camp beneath a withered oak, its roots clawing at the earth like the fingers of a dying man. His fire was small, fed by damp wood that smoldered more than it burned, casting long flickering shadows against the hollow trees. He unfastened his weathered breastplate, setting it beside his sword, and removed his helm, shaking loose the dark strands of hair clinging to his sweat-damp forehead. Sleep did not come easily, but exhaustion was its own kind of master, and soon he succumbed to restless slumber. The dream took him immediately. He stood atop an impossible tower, its stones alive and shifting, warping beneath his feet like water turned to solid form. The tower rose into a sky that was not a sky, a swirling vortex of shifting hues, blues and violets, where distant stars blinked like watching eyes. At the summit, hovering in the air, was a chalice of silver, gleaming unnaturally bright, untouched by dust or time. And surrounding it, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat, were flames, not red nor gold, but a twisting liquid blue, moving like tendrils of living thought. A voice, neither male nor female, neither near nor far, whispered, "You seek the Grail, but what if you seek the wrong one?" Julien took a step forward, his body aching to reach for the chalice. The air was thick with the scent of incense, of power, of forbidden knowledge. His breath came short. The fire did not burn, it called to him. "No," he whispered, gritting his teeth, fighting the unnatural pull. The chalice shuddered, and suddenly the flames lunged towards him, wrapping around his arms, licking at his flesh like hungry serpents. He gasped, but felt no pain. Instead, the fire crawled into his mind, whispering secrets he did not understand. Visions of kingdoms rising and falling, of knights in golden armor crumbling into dust, of the lady's face twisted into something not quite human. "This is the Grail you truly seek?" Julien tore himself away, his will snapping like a steel cord. The tower beneath him collapsed, stone shattering into a maelstrom of madness, and he was falling. And then, the awakening. Julien awoke with a strangled gasp, his body coated in sweat, his breath ragged as though he had fought a dozen battles in his sleep. The fire had died to cold embers, the forest thick with a deafening silence. Even the wind had stilled. His hands shook as he touched his arms, half expecting to find them burned, but there was nothing. No wounds, no scars. Just the memory of the fire, and the whisper of a voice not yet done with him. Beaufort whinnied softly, ears flicking towards something unseen in the darkness. Julien's grip found his sword, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned his gaze to the trees, scanning the shadows. There, standing just at the edge of the dying firelight, was a figure. Hooded, cloaked in tattered rags, its face obscured save for one glinting eye, gleaming like a single ember in the night. The stranger spoke, his voice dry and brittle as old parchment crumbling to dust. "You have seen the chalice, haven't you?" Julien did not answer. He did not lower his blade. The figure chuckled, stepping closer, his ragged robes shifting like maggot-riddled cloth. "You dreamt of the flames, and now you are marked." Julien's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The stranger tilted his head, his one eye reflecting something unnatural. "A warning," he whispered. "Your faith and your steel will be tested beyond mortal reckoning, Knight of Brettonia, and if you fail—" The wind howled suddenly through the trees, and in that instant the figure was gone. No footprints, no sound, just the emptiness where he had stood. Julien sheathed his sword, but his hand did not leave the hilt. His breath came slow, steady, but his pulse pounded with the weight of an unseen war. Mousillon had always been cursed, but now Julien knew with certainty he was no longer alone. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, something watched him. Chapter 2. The Labyrinth of Mirrors. The Ruined Chapel. Julien's path wound deeper into Moussillon's cursed forest, the air thick with the scent of rot and stagnant water. The sun had long since been devoured by the oppressive canopy above, leaving the world in a gray twilight that blurred the line between dusk and nightmare. Beaufort, his loyal destrier, snorted uneasily, his hooves crunching over a road that had once been well-traveled, now choked by gnarled roots and moss-covered stone. Then he saw it, a crumbling ruin, half consumed by the skeletal trees. A chapel, once a place of worship, now a corpse of faith. The stone walls were pockmarked with decay, the once proud stained glass shattered, leaving only jagged shards that jutted out like broken teeth. At its peak, the remnants of a weathered crest clung to the stone, a grail, defaced with what looked like deep claw marks. The air felt wrong here, heavier, suffocating, as though the ruin itself was still screaming in silent agony from whatever had defiled it. Julien dismounted, drawing the blade of Calmont with steady hands. The moment the steel left its scabbard, the air shivered. A whisper drifted from within the chapel, soft, beckoning. "Come, seeker." The portal of blue fire. Inside the chapel was a tomb. Benches lay overturned, covered in thick dust. The altar, once dedicated to the Lady of the Lake, was cracked in half, its shattered remains surrounded by deep, unnatural scorch marks. Something had desecrated this place. Something powerful. But the thing that made Julien's blood run cold was at the center of the ruin. A swirling vortex of blue fire, impossibly bright, yet casting no shadows. The flames did not consume the stone floor, nor did they produce heat. They simply existed, like a wound in reality, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Julien felt his gut twist, his instincts screaming to turn back, but he had come too far to retreat in fear. He tightened his grip on his sword, whispering a prayer to the lady. Then, before doubt could settle its claws in him, he stepped forward. The flames engulfed him. The labyrinth of mirrors. Oh, that was the first thing Julien felt. The fire should have burned, but instead it drained warmth from his flesh, seeping into his bones like the chill of a grave. Then came the light, a flickering, unnatural glow. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the chapel. He stood within an endless corridor of mirrors, stretching in all directions. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor, all were perfect reflections, capturing him from every angle. But something was wrong. The reflections were not the same. He turned to the mirror on his left. The man that stared back at him was older, his armor battered, his eyes hollow. a warrior who had seen too many battles, lost too much. He turned to the right. This time the reflection was monstrous, his own face twisted by corruption, his lips curled into a cruel sneer, his armor warped with chaotic sigils that pulsed like living veins. Julien's breath hitched. He stepped back, only for another mirror behind him to reveal yet another version of himself, this one kneeling, weeping, his sword cast aside in despair. Everywhere he turned, there were versions of himself that had lived different lives, followed different paths, some noble, some broken, some beyond saving. And then the voices started. You will never find the Grail. Brettonia is built on lies. You are already lost. Your father was a fool, and you follow his path to ruin. The voices came from the mirrors themselves, each reflection speaking in his own voice, yet not his own words. Julien gritted his teeth. This was a test, a cruel, insidious test meant to make him doubt himself, doubt his faith. He raised his sword, ready to shatter the illusions, but the moment the blade touched the glass, his own reflection smiled. Strike me down, and you become me. Julien froze. His knuckles went white around the sword hilt. His mind raced. If he attacked, if he let his rage consume him, would he fall into the trap? Would he become one of these reflections? The labyrinth was not just a prison, it was a choice. Would he fight, or would he trust his faith? Julien took a breath. Then he closed his eyes, breaking the illusion. Darkness. No mirrors. No voices. Only his own heartbeat, steady and unshaken. He took a step forward, then another. With every movement he ignored the whispers, ignored the temptations to open his eyes. Trust in the lady. He walked blind, but with conviction. The voices screeched, the reflections pounded against the glass, but they could not touch him. The labyrinth was nothing without his fear. And then a shattering sound, like 1,000 mirrors exploding at once. Light blazed behind his eyelids, and Julien felt the cold recede, the ground stabilize beneath him. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the ruined chapel. The portal was gone. The air was still once more, but the weight of unseen eyes remained. Julien inhaled deeply, sheathing his sword. He had passed the first test, but he knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Wager of the Trickster. The Shifting Crossroads. Julien rode in silence, his body still tense from the labyrinth of mirrors. Though he had emerged victorious, the weight of the vision still clung to him like damp fog. He had seen himself broken, corrupted, defeated, and though they were nothing more than illusions, the doubt gnawed at his mind like a starving beast. The land ahead was wrong. The road that should have led deeper into Mousillon had changed. Where there had once been a single path, there were now 3. Julien pulled Buffa to a halt, scanning the twisted landscape. Each path was different. One a serpentine trail of broken stone, another a winding road that seemed to spiral upon itself, and the third a narrow, jagged pass flanked by towering obelisks covered in glowing runes. The air hummed with unnatural energy. Julien's instincts screamed danger. And then from the shadows of the crossroads, it stepped forth. The faceless knight. A knight clad in cobalt armor, his helmet a smooth, polished void where a face should have been, emerged from nothingness. His armor gleamed, reflecting the flickering light of a moon that had not been there before. Julien's hand instinctively went to his sword. The faceless knight chuckled, his voice like a whisper carried by the wind. A lost knight, standing at a crossroads. How poetic. Julien's grip on his hilt tightened. Name yourself. The figure took a slow step forward, the sound of his footsteps echoing unnaturally, as if he walked upon a surface that did not exist. I am a simple gambler, a trickster who enjoys a game, And you, Bretonnian, have wandered into my domain." Julien scowled. "I do not play games with servants of chaos." The trickster laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. "Oh, but you already have, dear knight. Did you not choose to step into the mirror? Did you not dream of the chalice?" Julien's blood ran cold, but he did not let the creature see his hesitation. "No matter," the trickster continued, gesturing toward the 3 paths. "You must choose your way forward, but let us make it interesting." He raised a gloved hand. And suddenly, the sky shifted. The moon above began to change, its pale light twisting into a swirling clock, ticking away time that should not exist. "You have until the moon completes its cycle. Choose the true path before then, or be lost forever." The air rippled as the roads twisted before his eyes. The deception of the maze. Julien gritted his teeth, staring at the paths. Everything about them was wrong. Each one shifted subtly, the landscapes blurring, flickering, changing. The path of broken stone now looked more stable. The spiraling road seemed to lead toward something golden, shining, inviting. The ruined obelisks whispered words in a language he did not understand. Tzeentch's deception was working to confuse him, to erode his certainty. "You could take your time," the trickster mused. "Consider your options. Find the safest way." Julien ignored him. He closed his eyes, tuning out the whispers, the illusions, the shifting of reality. He thought only of the Lady of the Lake, of her light, her guidance, her grace. "Lady, guide me." And then he opened his eyes. The safest roads no longer seemed safe at all. The golden path now looked false, too perfect, too easy. The spiraling road was a lie designed to trap him in an endless loop of doubt. But the third path, the one surrounded by shifting shadows, its form unstable, its way treacherous, called to him. It felt real. The trickster noticed the shift in Julien's gaze. His head tilted slightly, as if in curiosity. "A bold choice, knight." Julien spurred Beaufort forward, ignoring the doubt clawing at his mind, ignoring the trickster's presence entirely. "I do not play by your rules, Damon." The trickster's laughter turned into a snarl. The shadows around the crossroads exploded outward, coiling like tendrils, reaching to stop him, but it was too late. Julien charged forward through the storm of illusions, his faith unshaken. The moment his horse's hooves touched the cursed path, the trickster let out an inhuman screech and then vanished, consumed by his own shattered game. The crossroads collapsed behind Julien, leaving only the single road ahead. Victory through faith. Julien did not look back. The trickster had tried to make him play the game, tried to make him doubt himself, doubt his choices, but he had denied chaos the satisfaction. He had trusted in the lady. The road ahead was dark, filled with more trials he could not yet see, but he had made his choice, and he would not be toyed with. Chapter 4. The City of the Forsaken. The twisting gates. Julien rode onward, leaving behind the shattered illusion of the trickster's crossroads. The air grew heavier, thick with an unseen pressure, like the world itself was folding inward. The road beneath him seemed stable one moment, then rippled like water the next, shifting between cobblestone and dirt, then to something unnatural, smooth and glass-like, reflecting a sky that did not belong to this world. Beaufort whinnied uneasily, the warhorse's instincts sensing something was terribly wrong. Then, through the mist ahead, Julien saw it. A city. Tall spires of twisting stone, grand archways that curved in ways no mortal architect could construct. The towers leaned and bent, some appearing upside down, others floating, unmoored from the earth. The streets ran in impossible directions, some spiraling into themselves, others vanishing into thin air, leading nowhere. A city that should not exist. Yet the banners were familiar. Julien could see the crests of Brettonia, the sunburst of the Empire, the sigils of Estalia and Tylia, even the ancient runes of the dwarfs and the sun emblems of the Southlands. As he rode closer, a terrible realization clawed at his mind. The banners were faded, some so old they crumbled to dust with the wind. The knights who never left. The city's gates stood wide open, inviting him in. Julien hesitated, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. He did not trust this place. It reeked of sorcery, of a trap waiting to be sprung. Yet the lady had brought him this far. He pressed forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, figures emerged from the mist. Men, knights, wizards and warriors, some clad in glorious armor, untouched by time. Others wore tattered rags, rust-eaten steel hanging from their shoulders. Some had the look of hardened veterans, their faces lined with age, but their eyes betrayed something unnatural. None of them looked old, and yet they had been here for lifetimes. A new one, a voice murmured. Another player in the grand game, whispered another. Julien reined in his horse, his gut twisting with unease. A knight stepped forward, a man in ornate golden armor decorated with symbols of Brettonia, yet marred with deep scars and burn marks. His face was youthful, but his eyes were ancient, filled with centuries of regret. "I know that look," the knight said, his voice heavy with something that could have been sorrow. "You believe this place is an illusion, that it is some trick of the dark powers." Julien's expression hardened. "Am I wrong?" The golden knight smiled, but there was no joy in it. "We all thought the same once." More figures stepped closer, an Estalian duelist with a rapier as thin as a whisper, an imperial witch-hunter with a long-barreled pistol, a dwarven slayer with a beard so long it trailed the ground, though his skin was untouched by age. "We were like you," the knight continued, "men of honor, heroes of our lands. We quested for the Grail, for glory, for the will of our gods. And yet we are still here. The grand game." Julien dismounted, his unease boiling into anger. "This is not fate," he declared. "This is a prison." "Aye," the witch-hunter rasped. "But there is only one way out." The golden knight turned, gesturing toward the center of the city, where a grand palace loomed, its sheep shifting and twisting with every passing second, as if it could not decide what it wanted to be. The grand game. "The master of the city demands it," another warrior said. "All who enter must play. The rules change, the stakes are real. Win and you may leave. Lose." A pause. No one finished the sentence. Julien shook his head. "No, I will not be bound by sorcery. My fate belongs to the lady alone." A few of the gathered warriors chuckled bitterly. "We all thought that." The golden knight stepped closer. "You cannot refuse. The city will not let you." Julien raised his chin. "Then I challenge the city itself." Silence. The gathered warriors stared at him, confused. Julien unsheathed the blade of Calmont, his voice ringing through the impossible streets. "You are all trapped here because you accept the game. I reject it." The air shuddered. The city shifted. The buildings around him trembled, their forms warping, bending, the impossible structures losing their cohesion. Somewhere, a scream echoed, not from a throat, but from the walls themselves. The golden knight stumbled back, his once unshakable composure crumbling. "No, no, you cannot." Julien raised his sword high, the blade glinting in the shifting light. "By the grace of the Lady of the Lake, I deny you." A deafening crack split the air. The city screamed. The buildings began to collapse, dissolving into dust, the streets splitting open into nothingness. The gathered warriors cried out in agony, their forms breaking apart, like statues made of glass, fracturing into 1,000 shards. The golden knight reached toward Julien, his eyes wild with desperation. Please, don't let it end like this." Julien stood firm. This was never real. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, the entire city imploded into darkness. Awakening, Julien opened his eyes. He was lying on solid ground, the scent of wet earth and ash in the air. The city was gone. Nothing remained. No ruins, no people. Only silence. He pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his mind still racing from what he had seen. Had those warriors been real? Had they ever existed? Or had they been shadows, illusions, lost souls, twisted by the will of something greater? Julien did not know, but he did know one thing. The tricks of Tzeentch would not break him. He sheathed his sword, mounted Beaufort, and rode forward. The lady still watched over him. Chapter 5. The Grand Game of Fate. The Ruins of Deception. Julien stood among the shattered remains of the city of the Forsaken. Where once impossible spires had loomed, there was now only emptiness, a void where reality itself had unraveled. The air still hummed with unnatural energy, the dying echoes of the sorcery that had tried to claim him. He had rejected the grand game, refused to be a piece on Tzeentch's board, and now the city was gone. But even as he breathed deeply, trying to shake off the weight of its illusions, he knew it was not yet over. A presence remained. Something ancient, something forgotten, and it was watching him. A slow, guttural sound rolled through the mist, laughter, dry and rasping, like the crackling of burning parchment. "You think you have won?" Julien turned. From the dissolving shadows of the broken city, a figure emerged. The Knight of the Broken Code. It moved like a man, yet there was nothing human left in its form. Its armor had once been Bretonnian, but it was now corrupted beyond recognition, gold filigree now warped into jagged, writhing veins, the steel blackened and pulsing with unnatural energy. The helmet was elongated, twisted into something almost bestial, the visor split open to reveal a grinning maw, filled with too many teeth. In one hand the creature held a knightly longsword, but its blade dripped with fire that burned a sickly blue, the same shade as the cursed flames Julien had seen in his visions. The voice that spoke was mocking, yet tinged with something else, pain, regret. "You stand upon the bones of the city, knight." And yet, the game is not finished. Julien took a step forward, gripping the blade of Calmont. "Who are you?" The creature tilted its head, as if remembering something distant and forgotten. "I was the last." The voice grew heavier, as though it carried centuries of weight. "The last knight who sought the Grail. The last fool who came to this place, believing he was strong enough to resist its temptations." The creature raised its flaming sword, the heat warping the air around it. "But there is no victory here, only the game, and I am its champion." With a snarl, it charged. A duel of light and darkness. Julien barely had time to react before the creature was upon him. Their blades clashed with a force that shook the ground, sending sparks flying through the mist. The moment their swords met, a wave of searing heat pulsed from the demon knight's weapon, and Julien felt his very soul recoil from its touch. This was not a simple enchantment. It was corruption made manifest. The creature struck again and again, faster than any mortal knight should have been able to move. Julien parried desperately, steel ringing against steel. Every impact sent a jolt of unnatural energy up his arm, his muscles burning with unnatural fatigue. The demon knight fought with brutal efficiency, a perfect fusion of knightly skill and demonic savagery. But Julien fought with something else. Faith. He blocked a strike meant to take his head, twisting to the side and countering with a swift riposte. His blade bit into the creature's armor, and for a moment the thing hesitated. "Do you even remember your name?" Julien asked, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. The creature snarled. It swung its sword with reckless fury, but Julien could see it was faltering. "You once served the lady." He dodged a downward slash, shifting his stance. "You once lived by the code of chivalry." The demon knight hesitated for a fraction of a second. Julien pressed on. "You were a knight, not a pawn of chaos, not a prisoner of this accursed game." The flames on the demon's sword flickered. Its breathing grew ragged, its movements less certain. For the first time, doubt entered its hollow eyes. "Silence!" it roared, but the fire in its voice was waning. Julien took a step forward, his sword lowered. "The lady does not abandon her knights." The demon shook violently, its twisted body convulsing. "No, she has not forgotten you." The creature let out a terrible cry, half rage, half despair, and staggered back. The fire died from its blade. Its armor began to crack, as if something inside was breaking free. "Who am I?" Julien drove his blade through the thing's chest, not as an execution, but as an act of mercy. The demon knight let out a final shuddering breath. Then, with a whisper, it was gone. The grand game ends. The moment the demon knight fell, the world around Julien shuddered. The broken city groaned as its remains began to unravel, the last remnants of its deception collapsing into dust. All around him, shadows twisted and broke apart, forming into figures of men and women, knights, wizards, warriors, those who had been trapped within the game for centuries. They looked at Julien with widened eyes, as if awakening from a long nightmare. One by one they faded, their souls finally released from the curse of the game. The land itself began to stabilize, the shifting sky clearing, the madness retreating. Julien exhaled, his breath steady. It was over. He turned to where the demon knight had fallen. There, lying amidst the scattered embers, was something small and simple. A crest, barely visible beneath the soot, a falcon's sigil upon a battered silver pendant, a Bretonnian knight's medallion. Julien picked it up, brushing the ashes away. Rest now, lost one. With that, he mounted Beaufort, his resolve stronger than ever. The grand game had tried to consume him, but he had shattered it. And now, the road ahead awaited. Chapter 6. The Knight Who Never Was. The Path to Damnation. The road stretched ahead of Julien, but it was no longer the world he knew. The grand game was over, yet the air still hummed with unseen energy, and the sky above had turned unnaturally deep blue, like the color of dying flames. The land itself felt less real, shifting subtly at the edges of his vision, as if it did not know whether to exist or fade into oblivion. Beaufort walked carefully, the destrier's ears flicking back, as if he, too, sensed the corruption in the air. Julien's grip on the blade of Calmont was steady, but his heart was wary. He had shattered the illusions of the game, freed the souls trapped within the cursed city, and yet the trial was not over. Ahead, the road ended in a pool of darkness, a void, a rip in reality, waiting for him. There was no other path. Julien dismounted, running his fingers across his horse's flank. "Stay here, my friend." Beaufort snorted but did not resist. He too understood this was not his fight. Sword in hand, Julien stepped into the abyss. The mirror of lies. The darkness swallowed him whole. At first there was nothing, no sound, no air, no weight to his own body. He felt as if he were floating, untethered from the world. Then, light, not golden nor warm, but a twisting, pulsating light of shifting blues and purples, as if the sky itself had been broken into liquid form. And in front of him, standing upon an invisible surface, was himself. Or rather, the thing that wore his face. It was Julien, down to the armor, the surcoat, the sword. But where Julien's features were sharp with purpose and determination, The reflection's face was twisted in an eerie mockery of a smile, its eyes gleaming with something unnatural. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen force pressing against Julian's chest. "At last," the reflection said, voice sickly sweet, "we finally meet." Julien did not flinch. "I know what you are." His mirror image laughed. "Do you?" It tilted its head, stepping closer, each movement unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. "I am you, Julien de Calmont, the you that was honest enough to see the truth." The false knight extended a gauntleted hand, gesturing to the swirling void around them. "Tell me, have you not felt it? The weight of your quest? The silence of your so-called goddess?" Julien said nothing. "You are chasing a lie," the reflection whispered, its voice slithering into his ears. "The Grail is a story told to men too afraid to see the world as it is. Brettonia is rotting from within, its nobility corrupt, its people abandoned. And your lady?" The reflection's mocking grin widened. "She is just another lie." The words struck like dagger points, aimed at the softest parts of his mind. Julien tightened his grip on his sword, yet something in his chest ached. It was true that the Grail had always seemed just out of reach. It was true that Brettonia's lords were often cruel, that the lady had never spoken directly to him, never offered him more than fleeting dreams and distant hope. What if... No. He clenched his jaw. "You want me to doubt, to falter. But I have already seen the tricks of your kind." His reflection let out a mocking sigh. How predictable. Then it moved, blindingly fast. Faith against the darkness. Julien barely had time to raise his sword before the reflection was upon him, its own corrupted blade crashing against his. The impact sent a shock wave through the void, the unnatural light flaring violently as their weapons met. The false knight fought without hesitation, each strike aimed to break Julian's guard, to exhaust him, to overwhelm him. Julien gritted his teeth, blocking, dodging, but he could feel the pressure of every swing reverberate through his bones. "Why do you resist?" the reflection hissed, shoving him back with unnatural strength. "You already know the truth." Julien staggered, but he did not fall. "I know one thing, demon." He lowered his blade. His reflection paused. Julien closed his eyes. "The lady is with me." The reflection snarled, "You are a fool." Julien did not move. He let the words settle into his soul, let his faith fill the cracks of doubt that the creature had tried to carve into him. "She has never abandoned me." The air trembled. The reflection raised its corrupted sword, ready to drive it through his heart. Julien did not react. He stood tall, unafraid. "I reject you." The void shuddered violently. The moment the words left his lips, the reflection's eyes widened, and cracks began to form along its skin, along its armor. It screamed, not in anger, but in fear. "No, no, you must doubt. You must question. You cannot." The false knight shattered, its form collapsing into countless shards of blue glass, each piece fading into nothing. Julien breathed deeply, the weight on his shoulders lifting. The illusion was broken. The void collapsed. Victory beyond the blade. When Julien opened his eyes again, he was back. The road was solid beneath his boots, the sky above no longer shifting, no longer filled with lies. Beaufort stood nearby, waiting patiently, as if knowing the battle had never been one fought with steel. Julien exhaled. Tzeentch had sent doubt against him, had tried to twist his mind, make him question everything he believed. But faith had carried him through. He sheathed his blade, mounting his horse. The path ahead was clear, and the lady was still watching over him. Chapter 7. The Warpfire Chalice. The Road to Temptation. The cursed road stretched before Julien, leading into the heart of the unknown. The air was thick, dense with unseen energy, the very fabric of reality pulsing beneath his feet. The shadows cast by the trees around him moved unnaturally, as if whispering to one another, conspiring in hushed voices. Buford, ever loyal, snorted uneasily, his muscles tense beneath the knight's steady hands. Julien's breath came slow and measured. He had faced illusions, fought daemons, seen the darkest version of himself, and yet he felt that the true test was still ahead. Then the world shifted. The landscape around him blurred, twisting like liquid paint, reality dripping away in great cascading folds. The trees melted into mist, the sky cracked apart like shattered glass, and from the emptiness beyond, something emerged. A tower, impossibly tall, impossibly vast, spiraled into the heavens before him, its very shape shifting and changing as though it had no true form. At its peak, suspended in the air like an offering to the gods, was the chalice. The silver chalice from his dreams. The call of the chalice. The cup was beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, gleaming with an ethereal glow, its surface smooth as liquid moonlight, its shape warping ever so slightly when one tried to focus on it. And within the liquid burned. It was neither wine nor water but pure warpfire, shifting between colors that had no names, a substance that pulsed like the very essence of knowledge itself. Julien's body tensed, but his mind remained still. A voice drifted from the shadows, wrapping around him like a cold breath. To drink is to know. Julien said nothing. To know is to change. The whisper became a symphony, a chorus of voices rising from the depths of the void, each one a different version of himself. The lady has given you nothing but silence. She lets you suffer while I offer you the truth. The Grail is here. Take it. Become more than a man. The chalice floated down before him, hovering just within reach, its surface reflecting his face, except his reflection was not his own. The image staring back was distorted, his eyes burning with unnatural wisdom, his armor lined with shifting runes, his very presence too great for a single form to contain. It was himself, Julien de Calmont, as he could be, as he would be, if he accepted the gift. Julien knelt before the chalice. He took a slow breath. Then he lowered his sword. Rejection of the false Grail. The voices went silent. Julien closed his eyes and whispered, "My lady, I seek only you." The chalice shuddered. A single crack formed along its perfect surface. Julien did not open his eyes. He did not look upon the false promises before him, did not gaze upon the illusion of power. Faith is not a question. It is a certainty. You would refuse knowledge, the voice snarled. You would deny the gift that only the worthy can take? The chalice shook violently, the warpfire inside boiling, spilling over the edges. Julien remained still. She will never answer you, the voice hissed, growing more frantic. You kneel before a dream while I offer you reality. The chalice fractured further, its glow flickering, its form beginning to wither. Julien opened his eyes. He stood. He did not reach for the chalice. Instead, he turned away from it. And with that final rejection, the chalice screamed. The warpfire exploded outward, not as flame, but as shattered fragments of a dying illusion, the chalice collapsing in on itself, its silver warping into 1,000 broken reflections before disappearing into dust. The world around him shuddered, and suddenly, he was alone once more. Tzeentch's defeat. The landscape had returned to normal. The tower was gone. The chalice was gone. The sky stretched above him, a simple, unbroken gray, no longer shifting, no longer filled with false gods and hollow temptations. Julien exhaled, his chest steady, his mind clearer than it had ever been. Tzeentch had tried to twist him, to make him reach for power, to make him crave knowledge beyond mortal limits. But a knight does not seek power. A knight does not seek knowledge. A knight seeks only virtue. Julien mounted Beaufort, his heart unburdened. Tzeentch's tricks had failed, and the lady's light still guided him forward. Chapter 8. The Siege of the Nameless Keep. The keep that should not be. The road had no end. Julien rode onward, but the landscape remained unchanged, as if he had been circling the same cursed ground for hours, days, perhaps longer. The horizon bent in unnatural ways, distant mountains shifting and reassembling, clouds folding over themselves like painted illusions being rewritten. He knew this was another of Tzeentch's tricks, but he pressed on. He had rejected the false Grail, denied the pull of knowledge and power. There was no place left for doubt. Then the air trembled. The ground beneath Beaufort's hooves shook violently, and suddenly the world around him tore apart like a curtain ripped from its frame, and he fell. Julien had no time to cry out, no time to pull at the reins, no time to react as the road beneath him vanished, and a new world crashed into existence around him. A battlefield without end. He landed hard, rolling across the blood-soaked dirt before forcing himself upright, blade in hand. The sound hit him first. A storm of steel and screams, the roar of war drums and the clang of armored bodies crashing together. The scent of burning flesh and churned-up earth filled his lungs, and around him, chaos. Hundreds, no, thousands of warriors, locked in endless battle, their banners tattered, their faces twisted with madness and fury. The forces were from all lands, all times. Julien saw Bretonnian knights, their once proud surcoats faded and torn, imperial soldiers in steel breastplates, their eyes hollow, Tailan mercenaries, Astalian duelists, even dwarfs with shattered axes, roaring in rage, and beasts among them, horrors not of this world. Mutants twisted by the touch of chaos, creatures with too many limbs, with faces frozen in permanent agony, with arms that ended in jagged talons instead of hands. And in the distance, looming over the battlefield like a dying god's tomb, stood the keep. Its walls were broken yet never fell, its gates stood open yet no one could enter, its towers burned but the fires never consumed it. The war had no victor. The war had no end. The keeper of the eternal war. Magnificent. The voice was soft, smooth, seductive, a serpent curling around his thoughts. Julien turned. A figure stood beside him, though he had not heard it approach. Draped in robes of deep blue, etched with shifting sigils that pulsed like living veins, its face was hidden beneath a hood as black as the void. "This is a war without consequence," the figure continued, gesturing toward the battlefield with an air of mocking admiration. "An endless song of steel and flesh, a masterpiece of ever-changing fates." Julien raised his sword. "Another trick of your kind, demon." The figure chuckled. "No trick, knight. A gift." It stepped forward, the air around it bending like rippling water. "You can end it, you know. One word, one choice, and the war stops. The keep crumbles, the warriors are freed. No more pain, no more suffering." The figure turned to face him fully, and for the first time Julien saw its face beneath the hood. It was himself. Not twisted like the reflection he had faced before, not corrupted, but calm, untouched by battle, eyes filled not with rage, but understanding. "All you must do," the other Julien said, "is claim the keep as your own. Speak the words, and the war ends." Julien's heart thundered in his chest. This was different. Not an illusion, not a physical battle, but a choice. Tzeentch had shifted its tactics. It no longer sought to break him with force or deception. Now it sought to make him bargain. But the lady did not bargain, and neither would he. The prayer of the righteous. Julien stepped forward, not toward the false version of himself, but toward the battlefield. "What are you doing?" the other Julien asked, voice tight with irritation. The warriors continued to fight, trapped in their madness. They had no leader, no direction, no hope. Julien raised his blade high. "The knights of Brettonia." His voice cut through the chaos like a war horn, booming across the field. Some warriors hesitated, their blood-stained hands shaking, their unseeing eyes flickering with something almost human. "Soldiers of the Empire, dwarfs of Karazankar, men of Talia, Estalia, all who still remember honor." More warriors staggered back, their weapons lowering, their faces contorting in confusion. "This battle is a lie." The keep rumbled, as if something within had been struck. "You fight without purpose, without end, without hope." Julien knelt, blade plunging into the ground, his hands clasped in prayer. "But the lady watches, and she has not forgotten you." The air shuddered. The warriors froze, their madness flickering like dying candle flames. "Pray with me." Silence. Then, a single voice. A knight, his banner tattered, his face streaked with blood and sorrow. He knelt. Then another, and another. The sound of swords clattering to the earth echoed across the battlefield. The keep began to collapse. The end of the siege. The hooded figure screamed, its form writhing, warping in desperation. "No, you cannot do this. You cannot break the cycle." Julien stood tall, voice unwavering. "You never had a hold on me, Damon." The keep shattered, its towers crumbling into dust, the battlefield disintegrating into nothingness. The warriors let out shouts of freedom, of release, as their forms vanished, their souls finally liberated. The hooded figure collapsed into itself, its form pulled into the abyss, its voice fading into the wind. "No, you were supposed to play the game?" And then there was nothing. The road ahead. Julien stood alone. The battlefield was gone. The keep was gone. The road was clear. He exhaled. Tzeentch had tried to trap him, had tried to make him play by its rules, fight its war, claim its power. But he had denied it. Julien mounted before his resolve unshaken. The lady's light still guided him, and he would see this quest to its end. Chapter 9. The Price of Knowledge. The Road of Memory. Julien rode through the ashen remnants of the battlefield, the shadows of war fading into the distance. The air felt lighter now, as though the very world had exhaled, relieved of the cursed weight it had borne for so long. But he was not fooled. Tzeentch had not given up. Buford moved cautiously beneath him, hooves crunching over the withered grass of a land that should not exist. The horizon ahead was shifting, distant hills melting like candle wax, the sky above twisting in impossible patterns. A trap lay ahead. Julien knew it. And yet, he pressed on, a knight does not turn back. Then the world changed. A single blink, and he was no longer on the road. Instead, he stood upon a vast open field beneath a sky of blood-red clouds. And before him, his father died, again, the truth of a fallen knight. The battlefield was not unfamiliar. Julien recognized the rolling green of Bretonnian soil, the ruins of a once proud village still smoldering, the bodies of knights and peasants alike, strewn across the blood-drenched earth. He knew this place. It was where his father had fallen. Julien's hands clenched into fists as he stepped forward, his boots sinking into the blood-stained mud. He had been a child when it happened, too young to fight, too young to witness the horror, but the songs, the tales. The legend of Julien de Calmont had been told for years. A great and noble Grail knight, defender of the weak, slayer of chaos, fallen in battle against the northern raiders of Norska. A warrior who had stood alone at the village's gates, his sword raised high, the lady's light burning in his soul as he cut down wave after wave of the corrupted. Julien had lived his entire life believing in that story. But now he saw the truth, and it was nothing like the songs. The betrayal. Julien de Calmont was not alone when he fell. The battle raged around him, but it was not the Norskians who struck him down. Julien watched, powerless, horrified, as his father fought like a lion, his blade flashing like silver fire, cutting through the northern raiders like wheat before the scythe. He should have won. He was winning, until a dagger came from behind. A knight, one of his own, drove a blade between his ribs, the steel slick with poison, piercing through his armor at the weakest point. Guillaume staggered, his sword faltering, his breath hitching in pain. He turned, his golden eyes wide with betrayal, but there was no time to react. The Norskins swarmed him. Steel crashed against steel. Flesh was torn apart. Blood splashed across the mud. Guillaume roared in defiance, but he was too weak now, his body failing him as the raiders tore into him, their axes biting deep, their savage blades hacking away at his once glorious form. He fell to his knees, his sword sinking into the earth. And the knight who had betrayed him? He simply watched, and then he walked away, leaving Guillaume to die alone. The whisper of vengeance. Julien trembled, his breath ragged, his heart hammering like war drums inside his chest. Now you see, the voice of Tzeentch coiled around him like a serpent, smooth, poisonous, insidious. Your father did not fall to the enemies of Brettonia. He was slain by those he trusted, by those he fought beside. Julien gritted his teeth, his fists shaking. And the man who did it? He still walks, still breathes, still wears his armor, sings his prayers, feasts in Bretonnian halls while your father's bones rot beneath the earth. A vision flashed before Julien's eyes, a castle hall, golden banners hanging from the walls, a lord in gleaming plate lifting a goblet and a toast, his face aged but unchanged, the same face that had looked upon Guillaume's death with cold indifference. Say the word, Tzeentch whispered, and I will bring you to him. I will put the sword in your hand, and you may deliver justice. Julien's fingers drifted toward his blade. The rage inside him was a living thing, a fire burning so hot it felt like his very blood had been set aflame. It would be so easy to hunt him down, to drive steel through the traitor's heart, to avenge his father. The warrior's code did not forbid vengeance. Honor demanded it. Julien's fingers wrapped around the hilt of the blade of Calmont. And then he let go. Forgiveness over vengeance. The word rang through the void, stronger than steel, clearer than any war horn. Tzeentch's presence shuddered, recoiling like a beast struck by light. No, the voice hissed. Julien's gaze was steady now, his rage tempered into resolve. I will not play your game. This is not a game, knight. This is justice. This is poison. Julien stepped back from the battlefield, from the memory, from the lie that was meant to consume him. My father is gone. Nothing I do will bring him back. But you could. What? Julien cut him off, voice like iron. Slaughter an old man in his castle? Murder a knight of my homeland? He shook his head. No, that is not justice. That is not the way of the lady. The world trembled, the battlefield cracking apart, the illusion breaking. Your mercy makes you weak. No, it makes me free. And with those words, the vision shattered. Looking forward, Julien found himself standing on the road once more, the weight of the past lifted from his shoulders. The betrayal still burned in his heart, but he did not let it consume him. The past could not be changed, but a knight must look forward. He mounted Beaufort, gripping the reins. Rest well, father, he murmured. I will not fail you." And with that, he rode onward, leaving the past behind. Chapter 10. The Covenant of the Maze Lord. The tower at the end of the world. The road had ended. For days, or perhaps it had been years, or no time at all, Julien had journeyed through the madness of Tzeentch's trials. He had walked impossible paths, seen the shadows of those lost before him, and felt the weight of choices meant to break him. Now, at last, he stood before the final threshold. A tower of pure magic rose before him, not built of stone, but of light, of shimmering energy that shifted between shapes, a fortress with no walls, a cathedral of lies, a monument to chaos itself. It was wrong. Every part of it pulsed with the same corrupt energy he had resisted again and again. Its very presence burned against the air, warping everything around it. This was where it would end, where he would finally face the one who had orchestrated this game. The Maze Lord awaited. The threshold of fate. Julien dismounted Beaufort, his armor heavy with the dust of the road. He gripped his sword and stepped forward. The moment his boot touched the threshold of the tower, reality collapsed. The chamber of the Maze Lord. Julien was no longer outside. He stood in a great chamber, an impossible place, where the walls were a living tapestry of visions, scenes of past, present, and future, shifting and twisting in endless motion. He saw Brettonia in flames, its castles reduced to ruin. He saw himself crowned, ruling as a warlord, his armor marked with sigils of chaos, his sword blackened with corruption. He saw a future where he was never born, where the world was darker, where the lady's light never touched the land. And in the center of it all, seated upon a throne of shifting crystal, was the Maze Lord. The being was not man, nor beast, nor god. Its body was wrapped in robes of woven illusion, its hands long and clawed, its face hidden behind a mask that shifted constantly, flickering between 100 different visages, a king, a beggar, a knight, a demon, a scholar, a child. When it finally settled, it was Julien's own face staring back at him. "At last, you have arrived." Its voice was not one, but many, speaking in 1,000 tones at once, layered upon itself like a symphony of madness. Julien did not waste words. "You are the one who has been testing me." The Maze Lord chuckled, the sound reverberating through the chamber. "Testing? No, my dear knight, I have been teaching." The walls around them rippled, showing visions of his journey, the city of the Forsaken, the warpfire chalice, the knight who never was, all the trials, all the temptations. "You have seen the truth," the Maze Lord continued. "You have glimpsed the greater tapestry of fate, and now you must decide your place within it." It stood from its throne, stepping forward, its robe whispering against the floor, like living silk. "Join me, and you will reshape your destiny. You will no longer be a mere piece on the board. You will be the hand that moves them." Julien held his ground. "And if I refuse?" The Maze Lord's many faces smiled at once. "Then you will leave empty-handed. No wisdom, no reward, only the knowledge that you were offered power and turned away." The room shrank around him, the walls pressing in, the weight of the choice bearing down upon his shoulders like a mountain. The choice. Julien inhaled. Then he drew his sword. The steel sang as it left its scabbard, its edge gleaming true and pure, untarnished by the illusions around him. "I need nothing but the lady's grace." The Maze Lord stopped. For the first time, it did not smile. It did not laugh. It was silent. And then, the chamber began to break apart. The death of the Maze Lord. The walls fractured. The visions shattering into a storm of broken light. The Maze Lord hissed, its many faces warping uncontrollably, its robes unraveling like a tapestry set ablaze. You dare turn from my gift?" It raised a clawed hand, summoning a storm of blue lightning, hurling it toward Julien. But the knight did not flinch. The moment the sorcery touched his blade, it vanished, devoured by the purity of his faith. The Maze Lord reeled back, screaming as its body split apart, as its power failed. "No, you must doubt, you must question, you must change." Julien stepped forward, raising his sword one final time. Not all change is growth. With a single, unyielding strike, he drove his sword through the Maze Lord's heart. The being let out a final, soul-rending wail, a scream of denial, of rage, of disbelief, as its body exploded into a whirlwind of shattered glass and dying magic. The tower collapsed. The illusions burned away. And when the dust settled, Julien stood alone. The road continues. The tower was gone. The sky above was clear, no longer shifting, no longer whispering. Julien sheathed his sword. He had rejected the covenant. He had stood against the will of the architect of fate. And he had won. With steady hands, he mounted Beaufort, his gaze set upon the road ahead. There would be more trials, more battles, but he would face them as he always had. With faith, with steel, with the lady's grace. And so he rode on. Chapter 11. The Duel Beyond Time. The final battlefield. The world was breaking apart around him. Julien stood alone in the ruins of the Maze Lord's domain, the last remnants of the Tower of Illusions crumbling into the abyss. The sky above him was not a sky at all, but a churning mass of visions, memories, and nightmares. Flashes of past battles, of the people he had failed, of the futures that could have been. The air trembled with unseen power, the very fabric of reality straining as if it had been stretched too thin. Then the Maze Lord spoke one last time. "You think this is over?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper in the wind, a roar in the thunder, a murmur in Julien's own mind. "You have denied the covenant. You have rejected my gifts. But you cannot reject your own past." The ground beneath him cracked open, and from the depths of that darkness they emerged. His failures, his regrets, his weaknesses, the army of the fallen. Julien watched as they surrounded him, rising like phantoms from the abyss, shaped from the same liquid shadows that had once built the walls of the Maze Lord's tower. But these were not faceless horrors. They were him, versions of himself from every moment of weakness, each one an incarnation of the fears, mistakes, and wounds he had suffered. One was young and afraid, a squire too slow to save a dying comrade, his hand still slick with blood he could not wash away. Another was scarred and weary, an older version of himself, hollow-eyed and broken, his armor cracked, his faith abandoned. A third was monstrous, a dark parody of his own form, a knight who had given in to Tzeentch whispers, his armor warped into sorcerous sigils, his sword burning with blue fire. There were dozens of them, circling him like wolves around dying prey. The Maze Lord's laughter echoed. "Face them, Julien de Calmont, face the weight of your own sins, and fall beneath them." Then they attacked. A battle unlike any other. The first lunged, a mirror image of his younger self, his face streaked with guilt and hesitation. His sword came down sloppily, but with desperate fury. Julien blocked the blow, his own blade meeting steel with a crack that sent sparks flying into the darkness. Another charge from behind, a version of himself with an empty gaze, a man who had lost everything. His strikes were calculated, relentless, merciless. Henry made no attempt to second strike. Julien pivoted, parrying one blade, ducking another, his instincts screaming. This was not a normal battle. Every opponent was himself. They knew his techniques, his counters, his weaknesses, and they would not stop. The air filled with the clash of steel as he fought against the tide of his own failures. A strike to the ribs, he twisted away just in time. A downward cut aimed at his skull. He barely raised his shield in time to deflect it. A brutal stab toward his heart. He sidestepped, but felt the edge of the blade graze his armor, sparks flying off the steel. Julien's breath came hard and fast, sweat mixing with the blood and grime of battle. They were endless. No matter how many he cut down, more took their place. The Maze Lord's laughter grew louder. "You are only human, knight. You can fight for eternity, but you will always be outnumbered, and in the end, you will fall." For a moment, Julien faltered. For a moment, the weight of the past threatened to break him. For a moment, the darkness began to close in. Faith is not a weapon, it is a shield. Then he understood. This was not a battle he was meant to win. It was a battle meant to break him. A battle that was never real to begin with. Julien stepped back, his breath steadying. He let his sword lower. The other versions of himself hesitated. The Maze Lord's voice snarled with sudden anger. "What are you doing?" Julien closed his eyes. "I do not need to fight my past." The Shadow Knights began to shudder, their forms flickering, becoming unstable. "I have already defeated doubt." One by one, the doppelgangers froze, as if something greater had seized them. The monstrous version of himself, the corrupted knight, the one who had given in to Tzeentch's whispers, let out a final, tortured scream before collapsing into dust. The Maze Lord roared in fury. "No, you cannot do this. You cannot win by doing nothing." The very air shattered, the tower breaking apart like glass being struck by a hammer. Julien opened his eyes. The illusions were gone. The shadows had vanished. And the Maze Lord was dying. The death of the chains of fate. The great sorcerer of Tzeentch staggered, his form crumbling, his robes of living illusion falling apart thread by thread. His many faces twisted in agony, the weight of the unraveling reality too much for even him to control. "You cannot escape fate," the Maze Lord howled. "You cannot—" Julien raised his sword one last time. "Fate does not command me." He swung. The Maze Lord was torn apart, his very essence splintering into nothingness. The sky above collapsed, the remnants of his domain imploding upon itself, the last chains of Tzeentch design shattering. The tower was gone. The trap was broken. Julien stood victorious. A knight walks free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world was silent. No illusions, no whispers. Just Julien and the end of the path. He sheathed his blade, his hand steady. The trial was over. The Lady's grace had guided him through. He had stood against chaos, against doubt, against fate itself. And he had won. With one final breath, he turned from the ruins of the Maze Lord's domain and rode forward. Chapter 12. The Final Trick. The Collapse of the Impossible. The world was dying around him. The tower of the Maze Lord was gone, shattered into 1,000 splintering shards of illusion and madness. The very fabric of Tzeentch domain was unraveling, collapsing in on itself like a house of cards caught in a hurricane. Julien stood at the heart of the dying dream, his sword sheathed, his eyes steady. He had endured. He had resisted every trick, every whisper, every false promise of power. And now Tzeentch had lost. But the god of change was never silent. "You think you have won?" The words did not come from one place. They slithered from the cracks of reality itself, crawled from the dying light, twisted through the air like the final breath of a drowning man. "Do you not feel it?" The ground beneath Julien's feet twisted, the stone cracking apart to reveal pools of shimmering liquid, reflections of what had been and what could be. Within them he saw himself, not as he was, but as something else. A man whose shadow did not match his form. A knight whose eyes flickered with something unnatural. a warrior who had walked through the madness of Tzeentch's realm and had not come out unchanged. "You have already been changed." The whisper slithered into his mind, a parasite seeking to take root. "You do not feel it, you do not see it. The Grail you seek will never be yours, because you are no longer the man who sought it." The reflections around him shifted. He saw himself returning to Brettonia, but when the people looked upon him, they shrank back. Their eyes filled with fear, not admiration. He saw himself kneeling before the lady's shrine, but when he gazed into the sacred waters, his reflection was wrong. Taller, darker, something off. "You do not belong to her anymore," the god whispered. "You belong to me." A moment of doubt. Julien's breath slowed. The visions clawed at his mind, trying to take root. Had he changed? Could any man walk through the nightmare of Tzeentch and emerge whole? He had seen too much, endured too many horrors. Had something, somewhere, taken hold within him? His hands tightened into fists, and for the first time his soul wavered. The strength to deny. But then, a voice. Not from the shadows, not from the god's trickery, but from within himself. A knight does not look back. His father's voice. His mother's voice. The voice of every knight who had ever ridden into battle, sword drawn, unshaken in the face of death. And beyond those voices, he felt her presence. Not words. Not a vision. Just the certainty of something greater than himself. The lady had never spoken to him, and she did not need to. Julien exhaled, his doubt burning away like fog before the morning sun. He turned away from the whispers, and he did not answer. The death of the lie. The realm around him began to scream. Tzeentch was not used to being ignored. "No," the god's voice howled. "You must question. You must doubt. You must change." But Julien did not listen. He turned, mounted Beaufort, and rode forward. And the moment he did, the illusions shattered completely. The pools of twisted reflection dried into dust. The sky of swirling madness cracked apart. The god of change, the great schemer, the endless trickster, was silent, because there was no trick left to play. The path home. Julien did not look back. The broken remnants of Tzeentch domain collapsed behind him, swallowed by nothingness. And before him, the road was clear. For the first time since his journey began, there were no shifting illusions, no lies waiting to ensnare him, no false paths twisting to lead him astray. Just the road ahead. His trials were not over. The Grail was still distant. But he had endured Tzeentch's greatest deceptions, and he had not faltered. With the wind at his back, Julien rode onward. Chapter 13. The Return to Brettonia. The Edge of Damnation. The air changed. Julien felt it before he saw it, the weight of sorcery lifting, the sickly pulse of Tzeentch domain fading into the void behind him. It was like stepping out of a suffocating tomb and breathing fresh air for the first time in years. For how long had he been gone? Days? Months? Longer? Beaufort snorted beneath him, sensing the shift, the warhorse's muscles relaxing as they crossed an invisible threshold. The twisted, impossible landscapes of chaos were gone. Before them the land was familiar once more. The cursed lands of Mousillon lay behind him. And ahead, Brettonia. A changed land, a changed night. Julien rode through the outskirts of a village, but something was wrong. There were no cheering peasants welcoming him home, no banners of noble lords raised high. Instead, he saw fear. The first to see him were children, peering from behind ruined carts and broken fences. Their eyes widened as they took in his battered armor, his tattered surcoat, the sigil of House Calmont barely visible beneath the filth and blood of his trials. A woman gasped. A man grabbed a rusted pitchfork, stepping forward cautiously. What devilry is this? Julien reined in Beaufaire, his gaze hard. I am no devil. The man flinched. Then what are you? For a moment Julien did not know how to answer. He had journeyed through madness, faced the whispers of a god, fought against his own soul, and yet he had emerged unchanged. Hadn't he? The villagers did not know him, but they sensed something. Not corruption, not chaos. Something other. A man who had gone beyond the veil of reality and come back whole. He pulled back his helm, letting them see his face, his eyes unwavering, untouched by corruption. I am Julien de Calmont, Questing Knight of Brettonia. I seek only the Grail, and my path has brought me home. A pause. Then, recognition dawned in the old man's face. De Calmont, the son of Guillaume? Julien nodded once. A murmur rippled through the gathered peasants. They lowered their weapons, their fear replaced by something else. Curiosity, respect, awe. But not celebration. Not yet. The weight of home. Julien did not stay. He could have spoken with them, told them of his journey, but what could he say? That he had seen a city of the damned, a chalice that burned with false fire, 1,000 versions of himself lost to fate? They would not understand. Perhaps they were not meant to. Instead, he rode for the nearest keep, seeking shelter within the walls of his homeland. The castle was humble, a lord's holding on the edge of Brettonia's borders, its ramparts worn from years of raids. The guards at the gate hesitated as he approached, their hands on their swords. State your name and purpose, traveler. I am Julien de Calmont, Questing Knight. The name carried weight. The guards looked at one another, then, slowly, they lowered their blades. Enter, my lord. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Julien stepped through the gates of a Bretonnian stronghold. The smell of baking bread, the sound of steel on steel, the voices of living men and women, they were almost overwhelming after the silence of the cursed lands. He was home, and yet the Grail still eluded him. The night unbroken. That night Julien sat alone in the castle's great hall, his sword laid before him, his hands resting on the pommel. A fire burned in the hearth, but it did not warm him. He had faced the worst of chaos, the most insidious of deceits, the deepest of his own doubts. And he had not broken. The Grail was still distant. But he knew something now, something that Tzeentch had failed to take from him. Faith was not about knowing. It was about trusting. He did not need to understand why the lady had not spoken to him, why she had let him suffer, why his path was harder than others. He only needed to believe, and that belief was stronger than any trick, any illusion, any lie whispered by a god of madness. He was still a knight of Brettonia, and he would find the Grail, no matter how long it took. With steel in his heart and faith in his soul, Julien rose, buckled his sword to his side, and prepared to ride again. Tomorrow, his quest continued. Chapter 14. The Trial of Faith. The Path to the Sacred Waters. The dawn sky was a pale, ghostly gray, the morning mist rolling over the hills like a silent tide. The land was peaceful, untouched by war, by chaos, by mortal ambition. Julien rode through the quiet woods, his battered armor still marked with the scars of his journey. His surcoat, once proudly displaying the sigil of House Calmont, was torn, faded, yet still wrapped around him like a second skin. He had fought battles that should have broken him. He had walked through madness and shadow, resisted the whispers of a god that twists destiny itself, and he had emerged unchanged. Or had he? Julien could not shake the weight pressing on his soul. The Grail was still distant, and though he had refused every temptation, rejected every trick, he did not know if the lady had ever been watching at all. Now she would answer him. The knights of Brettonia spoke of sacred lakes, places where the lady's hand touched the world, where the veil between the divine and the mortal grew thin. Julien had spent weeks searching for one, and now, at last, he had found it. The forest thinned, the trees giving way to a clearing, and there, the lake. It lay before him like a mirror of silver glass, untouched by wind, its surface so still it seemed to hold the sky itself in its reflection. The world was silent save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant chirp of waking birds. Buford stopped at the water's edge, nostrils flaring. The warhorse sensed the power here, a power unlike anything Julien had felt before. This was no illusion, not tricked. No lie whispered by a false god. This was real. The kneeling knight. Julien dismounted, his movements slow, deliberate. He removed his gauntlets, feeling the cold morning air against his skin. Then, with steady steps, he approached the lake. He knelt, placing his sword before him, its blade pressed into the soft earth, his hands resting upon the hilt. And he prayed, "My lady." His voice was hoarse, roughened by battle, by time, by doubt. "I have walked through darkness. I have fought against sorcery and madness. I have resisted temptations that no knight should ever have to face." His fingers clenched around his sword. "But I do not ask for a reward." His eyes closed. "I ask only for an answer." The lake remained still. The forest held its breath. Nothing. No voice, no vision. Just the wind. Julien's jaw tightened. Have I not proven myself? Have I not remained faithful? Silence. His heart thundered in his chest. Had it all been for nothing? Had he spent years of his life, endured unimaginable horrors, all for a dream that had never truly existed? A single word formed in his mind. Why? He lowered his head, his body trembling, not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. He had never faltered. He had never broken. But now, here, at the end of it all, he felt small. And then the water moved. The lady speaks. A single ripple spread across the lake. Then another, and another. The surface shimmered, its reflection changing, no longer showing the sky but something else. A glow rose from the depths, soft at first, then growing brighter, warmer, until the entire clearing was bathed in golden light. Julien's breath caught. A figure stood upon the water, her form woven from moonlight and mist, her presence both gentle and overwhelming. She was not human, not in the way mortals understood. Her beauty was something beyond flesh, beyond the world. Her hair flowed like silver silk, her eyes held the light of eternity, and in her hands she carried a single, shining chalice. The Lady of the Lake. Julien's heart stopped. For the first time since his journey began, she was here. She spoke, her voice not a sound but a sensation, like the first light of dawn touching the world. "You have come far, Julien de Calmont." His throat was dry, his body frozen, as if in the presence of a goddess. She took a single step forward, and the water did not ripple beneath her feet. "You have resisted the lies of chaos. You have denied the temptations of power. You have fought without faltering, suffered without surrendering, and endured without losing yourself." Julien could barely breathe. "And yet you still doubt." The words cut into him like a blade. His fists clenched, his head bowed. "I do not doubt you, my lady." "No," she said, "you doubt yourself." The lake glowed brighter, and the visions returned, but they were not of madness, not of chaos. They were of him. Every moment of hesitation, every fear, every wound he had suffered, not from the blade, but from the weight of his own soul. "Do you understand now?" she asked. Julien swallowed hard. "I do." It had never been about the trials. It had never been about the monsters he had slain, the enemies he had overcome, the battles he had won. It had been about faith. True faith, the kind that does not demand rewards, that does not need proof. "You have already found what you were looking for," she whispered. He looked up. The lady was smiling. Then she was gone. The light faded, the lake stilled, and the world was silent once more. But Julien did not feel alone. He knelt there for a long time, breathing deeply, letting the weight of everything settle upon him. Then, with newfound clarity, he rose. The Grail was still distant, but now he knew that one day he would find it. For the first time in his life, Julien truly believed. And with that he turned to his steed, mounted Beaufort, and rode onward, not as a man seeking an answer, but as a knight who had already found it. Chapter 15. The Knight's Gambit. The road to destiny. The forest behind him whispered with memory, but Julien did not look back. He rode onward, past the sacred lake where the lady had spoken, past the ruined paths where he had faced monsters and illusions, past the scars of a journey that had sought to break him, but had instead forged him anew. The road ahead stretched far and unknown, but he no longer feared it. His faith was unshaken. His heart was pure. And so he rode. The shadow on the horizon. The first sign of danger was the silence. The wind died, the birds fled, and even the distant chatter of a river seemed to vanish into nothingness. Julien slowed Beaufort to a halt, his fingers tightening around his reins. His instincts, sharpened by the endless trials of his journey, screamed a warning. Then, the stench. A foul, cloying reek of death and sorcery drifted through the trees. The air became thicker, heavier, like the very world was holding its breath. Julien reached for his sword, sliding it from its sheath with the soft whisper of steel against leather. The blade of Calmont gleamed cold and sharp, untarnished despite the horrors it had cut through. Then they came. The ambush. The first arrow struck his shield, splintering on impact. The second whistled past his head, missing by inches. Then came the roar of the damned. From the tree line they burst forth, warriors clad in ragged iron, their faces twisted with the taint of chaos, their weapons rusted but deadly. Some bore the marks of the dark gods, while others were little more than madmen, driven to bloodlust by their masters. Julien had seen their kind before. He did not hesitate. For the lady. Beaufort charged forward, a wall of muscle and fury, his armored hoofs pounding the earth as Julien lowered his sword. The first marauder did not even have time to scream. His body was split from shoulder to hip, blood spraying across the ground. The second lunged with a jagged spear. Julien twisted in the saddle, parrying the blow before bringing his sword down through the man's skull. A third swung a rusted axe, aiming for Beaufort's legs. The warhorse reared, kicking out, shattering the raider's ribs with a sickening crunch. More came. Julien met them head-on. Steel clashed against foul iron, blood stained the dirt, and for a moment the air was filled with nothing but death and fury. One warrior, larger than the rest, clad in blackened chain-mail, let out a bellowing war cry and swung a two-handed sword at Julien's chest. Julien caught the strike on his shield, the impact shaking his bones, but he did not yield. He pushed forward, knocking the brute off balance, and drove his sword into his exposed neck. The man gurgled, choking on his own blood before slumping to the ground. The survivors hesitated. They had expected easy prey. They had found a knight of Brettonia. And then they ran. Julien did not pursue them. Instead, he dismounted, his breath steady despite the battle's intensity. The bodies of the fallen littered the ground, their blood seeping into the hungry soil. Another victory. But the war never ended. The price of the quest. Julien looked at his blade, still dripping with crimson. How many more battles would there be? How many more enemies would seek to test him? He had spent years wandering, seeking the Grail, seeking purpose beyond mortal glory. And though the lady had spoken, his quest was not over. It may never be over. A knight does not seek peace. A knight does not rest. A knight rides forward, no matter how long the road. Julien wiped his sword clean, sheathed it, and mounted Buford once more. His body ached. His mind was weary. But his soul? The unbroken. A knight's gambit. The sky above was clear, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, casting golden light upon the land. The battle was done. The road continued. And somewhere, distant but not unreachable, the Grail awaited. Julien spurred Beaufort forward, the wind whipping through his hair, his heart light with purpose. The lady had not abandoned him. And the quest would never end. Not until he found it.